The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe, episode 54, Shame Societies. Religion, school, public shaming shame is the emotion that hides itself, yet it has always been one of the most powerful tools for shaping behaviour. Across history, cultures have built entire systems of control on shame. Religion cast it as sin, school systems used it to discipline, and today digital culture amplifies it into public spectacle. In a shame society, belonging is conditional. Step outside the approved script, whether through sexuality, belief, appearance, or even a single misjudged tweet, and the response is swift: humiliation, exclusion, punishment. What once happened in villages and pulpits now happens globally instantly, online. But here's the paradox: shame is not just destructive. At its root, it reflects our longing for acceptance, our fear of abandonment, our hunger for love. Societies exploit this vulnerability, but it also shows us something raw and human about our need to be seen. In this episode, we'll explore how religion and education institutionalize shame as a tool of discipline, how digital platforms weaponize humiliation in ways more brutal than ever before, what psychology reveals about the long shadow of shame on identity and belonging, my own reflections on how shame shaped my early life, and how I learned to recognize when it was mine and when it was society's voice speaking through me. Because shame is never just personal, it is cultural, systemic, collective. And until we see it clearly, we can't break free of the scripts it writes in our lives. Let's begin. The architecture of shame. Every society needs ways to regulate behavior. Some use law, some use ritual, but many, perhaps most, rely on shame. Shame is subtle because it works invisibly. Unlike punishment, which comes from outside, shame colonizes the inside. It convinces you that you are wrong, not just what you did. And in doing so, it makes control far more efficient. Shame as social glue and weapon. Traditional shame societies, from small tribes to imperial religions, depended on this. The fear of humiliation was more powerful than any guard or judge. People policed themselves long before others had to. But what starts as glue for community easily becomes a weapon of conformity, silencing difference and enforcing obedience. Attributes of shame society's internalization. The rules live inside you, even when no one is watching. Visibility, exposure, humiliation, and being seen as wrong. Conformity. Shame binds people into shared scripts of belonging. Control. Institutions use it to maintain hierarchy and obedience. Isolation, shame fragments, leaving people alone in their silence. Themes: how societies institutionalize shame. Religious morality. In Christianity, shame was entwined with sin, sexuality, doubt, disobedience, all coded as failures of the soul. In other traditions too, shame marked dishonor that stained families, not just individuals. Schools of humiliation, public punishment, dunce caps, being called out in front of the class. The lesson wasn't just about maths or reading, it was about obedience and the sting of ridicule. Public spectacle. From stocks in medieval towns to online culture today, shame has always had an audience. It binds the group together by exiling the individual. Conditional belonging. At its root, shame tells us love and community are conditional. Step outside the boundary and you risk exile. Personal reflection. I can trace the architecture of shame in my own life. School was one of the earliest places I felt its weight. I wasn't always a confident child, and when I struggled with something, a maths answer, a clumsy mistake, the humiliation of being called out lingered long after the lesson ended. It wasn't the failure itself that hurt, but the laughter, the sense of being marked as less than in front of others. Religion added another layer. Growing up, I absorbed the unspoken rule that some thoughts, feelings, or desires were unacceptable, not just mistakes, but sins. Lust, doubt, even curiosity carried an undertone of guilt. It was as though God Himself was watching, and any slip was proof of my unworthiness. I didn't need anyone else to punish me. The shame lived inside me, and I carried it silently. Looking back, I realize how effective those systems were. They didn't need force. They shaped me into self-surveillance, constantly asking, am I good enough? Am I wrong? Do I belong? That script followed me for years, long after the teachers and sermons had faded. Psychological insight. Shame as internalized surveillance. Psychologists differentiate guilt. I did something bad. From shame, I am bad. Guilt can lead to repair, while shame corrodes identity. Research by June Tangney shows that chronic shame is linked to depression, aggression, and avoidance behaviors. It's not just an emotion, it's a prison. Foucault's concept of the panopticon, where prisoners behave as if always watched, is useful here. Shame functions like an internal panopticon. Once we've internalized it, the gaze doesn't need to come from outside. We watch ourselves, punish ourselves, police ourselves. For me, this explained why, even when I was alone, I felt judged. Shame doesn't need an audience. It lives in the nervous system, in the quiet thought that if they knew the real me, I'd be rejected. That's the cruel genius of shame societies. They make us our own jailers. Embodiment prompt or practice. Think back to a time you felt ashamed as a child. Where in your body did you feel it? Your chest, stomach, throat? Was it tied to something you did or to who you were? Did the shame come from inside or from others' eyes? Spend a few minutes writing about it. Then notice if the echo of that moment still shapes your choices today. Integration moment shame societies work because shame lives inside us long after the external authority disappears. It binds communities through fear of humiliation, but at the cost of silencing individuality. Seeing this clearly doesn't erase the shame, but it starts to loosen its hold. Seed to plant this week: when shame arises, pause. Ask yourself, is this really my voice? Or is it the echo of a society, a school, or a system that taught me who I was allowed to be? Religion and the invention of sin-shame religion has always been one of the strongest carriers of shame. At its best, it offered meaning, belonging, and guidance. At its worst, it weaponized desire, doubt, and humanity itself into sins to be policed. Shame became not just a social force, but a sacred one, woven into rituals, scriptures, and confessions that mark the soul as perpetually at risk of falling short. When the sacred turns into surveillance, unlike laws, which punish actions, religious shame often targets thoughts, feelings, and impulses. You didn't need to act. The wrong desire was enough. That was the genius and the cruelty of religious shame. It didn't just regulate behavior, it colonized the imagination. Attributes of sin, shame, invisibility. Even your thoughts could condemn you. Perpetuity. No amount of goodness guaranteed freedom from falling short. Confession. Rituals of exposure, where you must reveal your failings. Submission. The authority of priests or elders framed as divine. Fear of exile. Belonging made conditional on purity. Themes: how religion wove shame into life. Original sin. Christianity begins with the idea that humanity is already guilty. Shame is not occasional, it is inherited. Sexual control. From Augustine's writings on lust to modern purity culture, sexuality has been one of the most heavily policed areas of religious shame. Confession and surveillance. Catholic confession created rituals of exposure where you reveal shame to authority. Even Protestant groups created accountability systems to police thoughts and behaviors. Honor and dishonor in many traditions. Shame isn't individual but collective. Dishonor taints family, tribe, even whole communities. God as witness. Belief in an all-seeing deity installs permanent surveillance inside the believer. Personal reflection. I wasn't raised inside the church, but Catholicism was in the background of my early years. I was christened Catholic, and though my parents didn't force me to go, my Italian grandparents encouraged my mum to take me. I remember being 7 or 8, taken with my sister to Sunday school to prepare for Holy Communion. What stays with me is not awe or reverence, but boredom. Sitting in a circle with children my age, listening to teachings that felt flat and meaningless. I wasn't rebellious, but I was curious. I asked questions. And apparently, that was the problem. After just my second visit, the Sunday school teacher told my mum it probably wasn't worth bringing me back. He asks too many questions. Looking back, I find that both funny and telling. A child curious about faith was seen as a disruption. The Catholic Church, I later realized, has long been more about control than curiosity, more about obedience than truth. The irony still strikes me. An institution claiming to represent God and Christ, yet silencing questions, and in too many cases, masking corruption and exploitation. Over the years, I've watched scandals break open, sex abuse cover-ups, trafficking, paedophilia cases tied to powerful figures. These aren't conspiracies, they've been exposed publicly, case by case, and it confirmed my sense that much of what I'd glimpsed as a boy, the hollow rituals, the fear of questions, was a facade. For much of my life, I didn't believe in God at all. The hypocrisy of religious institutions made faith seem hollow. But as I grew, as I experienced more of life, something shifted. My faith evolved. Today, I don't doubt there is a God, not the God of fear and shame, but something beyond institutions, something real, something I had to arrive at myself, not through catechism or surveillance, but through living. Psychological insight, sacred shame, and the inner judge psychologists call this introjection, when external rules become internal voices. In religion, introjection is intensified because those voices are framed as divine. When the inner critic carries God's authority, disobedience feels like cosmic betrayal. Freud saw this as the superego, the inner judge shaped by parental and cultural authority. Religion magnifies the superego to terrifying proportions, embedding shame into identity itself. Contemporary psychology recognizes this in scrupulosity, a form of OCD in which people are consumed by fear of sin and cycles of confession. It shows how religious shame can trap the imagination, punishing not only actions but even thoughts. For me, I see now that my questions as a child weren't rebellion, they were resistant, a refusal to let shame colonize my curiosity. And in time, that same refusal became the soil where my faith grew back, not in an institution, but in a personal sense of God beyond dogma, embodiment, prompt, or practice. This week, notice when shame rises in connection to belief, spirituality, or even doubt. Ask, is this shame about what I've done or about who I am? Then ask, whose voice is this really? A parent? A preacher? A culture? Write down whether this voice belongs to you or whether it was inherited. Integration moment. Religious shame often teaches us that we are flawed at the core, that our very thoughts condemn us, but much of that shame was never ours. It was scripted by institutions that thrive on obedience, not truth. When we separate faith from shame, what remains is something more human and perhaps more divine. Seed to plant this week. If shame arises in connection to belief or desire, pause. Instead of asking, what's wrong with me? Try asking, who benefits from me feeling this way? The answer may reveal that the shame was never meant for you at all. Schooling shame. Lessons in humiliation. If religion sought to shape souls through sacred shame, schools often picked up the baton with secular shame. For many, classrooms became less about learning and more about performance, where mistakes were punished, failures exposed, and conformity demanded. The classroom as stage schooling has never been neutral. Beyond literacy and arithmetic, schools instill obedience, competition, and hierarchy. Shame becomes the hidden curriculum, keeping children in line not only through discipline, but through humiliation, comparison, and fear of standing out in the wrong way. Attributes of schooling shame: public exposure, mistakes revealed in front of peers. Comparison, grading, ranking, and constant measurement. Ridicule, humiliation used as motivation. Conformity, shame deployed against difference or non-compliance. Fear of failure, learning tied to worth, not curiosity. Themes, shame as an educational tool, the rank and file. Tests and grades not only measure but rank, embedding competition. Falling short doesn't just mean not yet, it means you're less than. Shame as discipline, teachers, sometimes without malice, wield shame to keep order, calling out mistakes, mocking laziness, singling out bad behavior. Humiliation as social glue, peer groups enforce shame, bullying those who stand out, enforcing dress codes, mocking differences. The death of curiosity. Curiosity thrives in safety. Shame kills it. Children learn not to ask questions, but to avoid humiliation. Personal reflection. Looking back at my own school years, I can see how shame operated quietly, almost invisibly, shaping how I saw myself. It wasn't always about explicit punishment, sometimes it was subtler, like comparison. Test scores pinned up for everyone to see. Teachers praising one child and ridiculing another. I was never a troublemaker, but I noticed early how curiosity was treated. Ask the wrong kind of question, and you risk looking stupid, wasting time, or getting mocked. I'd already had a taste of this in Sunday school, where questioning authority got me labelled not worth bringing back. In school, it echoed the lesson wasn't be curious, it was don't stand out. There were also moments of humiliation that lingered. Times when a teacher would call attention to a mistake I'd made in front of everyone, or when peers would join in the ridicule. These weren't just passing embarrassments. They planted seeds of hesitation, teaching me to second guess, to self censor, to fear exposure. I can see now how much of that was less about learning and more about control. Schools weren't just teaching me maths or science. They were teaching me how to be obedient, how to avoid shame, how to measure myself against others. The irony is, those lessons often had more impact than the subjects themselves. Psychological insight, shame, and learning educational psychology shows how shame is one of the least effective motivators. While guilt can sometimes encourage repair, I did something wrong. Shame attacks the self. I am wrong. Studies show that students shamed for mistakes often withdraw, disengage, or even rebel. Lev Vygotsky's zone of proximal development suggests children learn best when supported just beyond their current ability. Shame collapses this. Instead of encouraging growth, it makes mistakes feel like identity failures. Research on toxic stress in childhood, Shonkoff et al. 2012, also shows how environments of chronic humiliation or fear impair learning, memory, and creativity. The brain under shame is focused on survival, not curiosity. For me, these insights explained something I'd felt but couldn't name. I wasn't bad at learning, I loved it in my own way. What I struggled with was the constant undertone of shame, the sense that education was less about discovery and more about avoiding humiliation. Embodiment prompt or practice this week. Reflect on your school years. Ask yourself, when was the last time I felt proud of learning? When was the last time I felt humiliated in learning? How did those moments shape the way I approach growth today? Write down one instance where shame silenced your curiosity and consider how you might reclaim that curiosity now. Without fear of ridicule, integration moment schools are meant to teach knowledge, but often what they really teach is shame. Performance over curiosity, comparison over individuality, fear over exploration. Recognizing this doesn't mean discarding what we learned, but seeing the hidden costs. The first step in unlearning shame is noticing where it first took root. Seed to plant this week. When you feel hesitation in asking, learning, or trying, pause. Ask yourself, is this hesitation about the task or about old shame still whispering? Curiosity thrives where shame loses its grip. Public shaming in digital life. If churches use pulpits and schools use classrooms, today the stage of shame is digital. Social media has turned public shaming into a spectacle watched by millions. A mistake, an unpopular opinion, or even a misunderstood joke can go viral, triggering waves of outrage. The mob moves silently online. The digital stocks may not hold us in a physical square, but the logic is the same: exposure, humiliation, and the stripping of dignity in front of an audience. The difference is scale. A village once witnessed shame, but now the entire globe can. Attributes of digital shame: virality, mistakes amplified beyond context. Permanence, shaming posts archived forever. Dehumanization, targets reduced to symbols of scorn. Performance, shaming becomes virtue signaling for the mob. Isolation, victims often left with reputational, financial, and psychological scars. Themes, the spectacle of digital humiliation, cancel culture. Accountability often merges with public execution. People lose jobs, reputations, and communities, not always because of justice, but because shame feeds clicks. The mob mentality, psychology shows individuals behave differently in crowds. Online anonymity amplifies this, making cruelty easier and empathy harder. Shame as currency, algorithms reward outrage. Platforms profit when we pile on, turning humiliation into engagement. No exit. Unlike older forms of shame, digital shame is permanent. A screenshot can resurface years later, haunting someone indefinitely. Personal reflection. When I think about digital shame, I can't help but recall how quickly the internet transformed from connection to judgment. In the early 2000s, when I was first using forums and chat rooms, the worst that could happen was an argument with a handful of strangers. Today, a single post can spiral out of control and define someone's identity overnight. I haven't personally been at the center of a viral pile-on, but I've felt the pressure of surveillance, the sense that whatever I say might be taken the wrong way, mocked, or used against me. It creates a constant self-monitoring, a kind of internal censor that feels less about honesty and more about avoiding shame. I've also witnessed others endure it. People reduced to hashtags, mocked without mercy, even when the original crime was small or misinterpreted. Watching this, I began to recognize how easily shame becomes spectacle. The mob isn't really seeking truth, it's seeking catharsis, entertainment, even superiority. It reminds me of my earlier experiences of shame in school. Ask the wrong question, get mocked. Only now, the classroom is global and the punishment can last a lifetime. Psychological insight, mob mentality, and digital outrage social psychology explains why digital shaming is so powerful. Gustave Le Bon's theory of crowd psychology, 1895, described how individuals lose personal responsibility when swept into collective outrage. Online anonymity intensifies this. People act in ways they never would face to face. Research on moral outrage, Feinberg et al. 2017, shows that expressing outrage online gives people a dopamine hit, reinforcing the behavior. Outrage becomes addictive, rewarded with likes and shares. Shame, in this sense, is commodified into engagement. Neuroscience highlights the cost to the shamed. Studies on social pain, Eisenberger 2012, show that humiliation activates the same brain pathways as physical pain. Digital shame isn't just words. It can feel like torture, leaving trauma that lingers long after the mob moves on. For me, this research makes sense of the atmosphere I feel online, the constant low-level fear of being misinterpreted or judged. It's not just paranoia, it's the psychological reality of living in a world where shame has been industrialized. Embodiment prompt or practice this week. Notice your own engagement with online outrage. When do you feel the pull to join in a pile-on? Does it feel like justice or like performance? What happens in your body when you witness public shaming? Write down one moment where you felt tempted to join in and pause to ask, what need is being met by participating? Integration moment. Public shame is no longer confined to pulpits or classrooms. It lives in our pockets, vibrating in our hands. Digital life has turned shame into spectacle, engagement, and profit. Seeing this clearly allows us to step back. We don't have to feed the mob. We don't have to let algorithms weaponize our instincts. Seed to plant. Next time you see someone shamed online, pause before reacting. Ask yourself, am I witnessing accountability or entertainment disguised as justice? Choosing empathy in that moment breaks the cycle of digital humiliation. Integration and reclaiming dignity. Shame has always been a social force. Religion, schools, and now digital platforms have all used it to shape behavior. Sometimes it protects communities. Often it wounds individuals. But the deeper truth is this: shame is not just something done to us. It's something we carry, sometimes long after the crowd has gone, beyond shame toward wholeness. The challenge of our age is not to erase shame, but to integrate it, to see it clearly, understand its role, and decide how to reclaim dignity in a culture that profits from our humiliation. Attributes of integration: awareness, recognizing when shame is external, not internal. Discernment, separating accountability from humiliation. Boundaries, refusing to participate in mob cruelty. Compassion, offering dignity where shame has stripped it. Wholeness, carrying imperfection as part of being human. Themes, moving through shame from punishment to accountability. True accountability heals, humiliation corrodes. We must learn to tell the difference. Self-compassion. Psychologists like Kristin Neff show that self-compassion interrupts the toxic cycle of shame, replacing "I am bad" with "I made a mistake." Cultural resistance. In a world addicted to spectacle, refusing to join the shaming crowd becomes an act of rebellion. Dignity as practice. To reclaim dignity is not abstract, it is daily work. Choosing honesty over performance, compassion over comparison, presence over fear. Personal reflection. Looking back over my life, I can see how shame shaped me, sometimes in obvious ways, like being humiliated in school, sometimes in subtler ways, like feeling pressure to perform. I can see how digital shame has created a constant low-level anxiety in adulthood, the fear of being misjudged, of saying the wrong thing, of being reduced to one mistake. For a long time, I let that fear dictate how I spoke, what I shared, even who I allowed myself to be. But through reflection, I've realized shame only has as much power as the silence it creates. When I speak it aloud, when I see it for what it is, a tool of control, not truth, it begins to lose its hold. Shame societies thrive on performance and suppression. Dignity thrives on honesty and presence. Psychological insight. The healing power of dignity. Brené Brown's research into shame resilience highlights that connection and empathy are the antidotes to shame. When we share our stories in safe spaces, shame dissolves. Philosopher Avishai Margalit, writing about a decent society, argued that true justice is not only about fairness, but about refusing to humiliate. A just world protects dignity, not just rights. Neuroscience adds weight. Studies on vulnerability, Croce et al. 2011, show that speaking painful truths reduces stress, lowers cortisol, and rewires our sense of agency. Silence keeps shame alive. Voice begins to heal it. For me, that's the most important realization. I can't erase the shame I've carried from childhood, from mistakes, from culture, but I can choose to face it, to speak it, and to build a life where dignity matters more than performance. That choice is the exit from shame societies. Embodiment prompt or practice this week. Take one small step to reclaim dignity. Share a story you've hidden out of shame with someone you trust. Write down one belief about yourself that was planted by shame and question if it's really yours. Notice when you feel the pull to hide and instead take one breath of presence. Integration moment. Shame will always exist, but we don't have to let it define us. Schools, churches, and digital mobs may try to script our worth, but dignity belongs to us. Integration means carrying imperfection openly, refusing to be reduced, and choosing presence over performance. Seed to plant this week. When shame whispers, "You are not enough," pause and reply, "I am human. I am whole." Let dignity be the soil where you root yourself. Shame at scale. The systemic view shame isn't only personal, it becomes embedded into the systems that raise us, teach us, and govern us. Religion codifies shame into morality. Schools turn it into discipline. And digital culture has amplified it into something global and permanent. When shame becomes infrastructure, in these spaces, shame stops being a passing feeling and becomes a mechanism of control, an invisible scaffolding shaping how we learn to behave. Attributes of systemic shame codified, written into laws, rituals, and doctrines. Collective, reinforced by peers, teachers, congregations, or entire online audiences. Performative, signaling belonging by shaming outsiders. Normalized, so constant it feels like just the way things are. Amplified, scaled by technology into something permanent. Themes: shame as social control, religious doctrine, original sin, confession, public repentance, all structured ways of embedding shame as a tool of obedience. Schools and public discipline, humiliation as punishment, being called to the front, scolded in front of peers, or given grades that rank you against others. These moments often stick longer than the lessons themselves. Digital shaming. In online spaces, shame becomes entertainment. Cancel culture, pile-ons, and mocking comments amplify vulnerability into spectacle. Algorithms amplify outrage because outrage keeps people engaged. The function of shame, it doesn't just punish, it maintains order. It keeps us compliant, fearful of standing out, and willing to trade authenticity for belonging. Personal reflection. For me, the clearest memory of systemic shame came not from religion, but from school. I was never someone who enjoyed being singled out, but teachers often used humiliation as a way of keeping order. I can remember the feeling of being put on the spot in front of the class, asked a question designed to expose that I didn't know the answer, or criticized for not paying attention. The sting wasn't just embarrassment. It was the realization that the lesson wasn't about learning, it was about control. Later, when social media arrived, I noticed the same mechanism at scale. Instead of one teacher, you had an entire audience ready to point, laugh, or pile on. I didn't always participate, but I felt the pull, the strange satisfaction in seeing someone else shamed, and the equal fear of being the next one in the firing line. What struck me, looking back, is how quickly shame moves from personal to collective. At school, if one person was shamed, the whole class got the message: don't step out of line. Online, it works the same way. Even if you're not the one being shamed, you're watching, learning the rules of what not to say, what not to post. Shame becomes an invisible fence, teaching us how to stay safe by staying small. Psychological insight. Shame as social technology evolutionary roots. Psychologists suggest shame evolved as a survival mechanism. Fall out of favor with the group and you risked exclusion or death. Foucault and discipline. In modern institutions, surveillance doesn't need to be constant. People internalize the watcher. The teacher, priest, or algorithm doesn't have to be present. We shame ourselves in anticipation. Digital pain. Neuroscientific studies show that public shaming activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. And unlike a slap on the wrist in school, digital shame lingers. It is replayable, searchable, permanent. Reflecting on this, I realized that the shame I carried wasn't just my own. It was patterned, taught, engineered. When I felt small for asking too many questions in school, or when I feared being judged online, I was living inside a system designed to make me monitor myself. Naming that difference between personal guilt and systemic shame has been freeing. It shifts the focus from what's wrong with me to who benefits if I stay quiet. Embodiment prompt or practice. This week, notice one situation where shame isn't just personal but systemic in a workplace, a group, or online. Ask yourself, who benefits if I stay silent or small? Whose script is this shame enforcing? What shifts if I see the shame not as flaw, but as evidence of control? Integration moment shame at scale is less about us and more about systems. Religion, schools, and platforms use it to discipline, to maintain order, to sell belongings. But seeing shame for what it is changes the story. It stops being a mirror of our failure and starts being a window into power. Seed to plant next time shame rises in a group context. Pause. Instead of collapsing inward, look outward. Ask, is this about me or about a system keeping me in line? That small reframe can turn shame from a cage into a clue. Reclaiming dignity in a shame society. Shame is one of the oldest tools of control. Religion codified it into morality. Schools turned it into discipline. Today, digital culture amplifies it into global spectacle. And somewhere in between, many of us learn to shrink ourselves, to stay small, silent, or compliant so we wouldn't be next in line. But shame doesn't have to end as control. When we see it clearly, it becomes a signal, not of our failure, but of the systems that profit from our self-surveillance. To reclaim dignity in a shameful society is to refuse to let humiliation define us. It's to remember that worth isn't given by institutions, peers, or platforms. It's lived from the inside out. So as you move through this week, notice where shame shows up in your life. Pause and ask, who benefits if I feel small? Whose story am I carrying? And then take one small step back toward your own presence. Because intimacy, dignity, and wholeness don't grow in the soil of shame. They grow in awareness, in honesty, and in the courage to stand as we are, unmasked, unperformed, and unashamed. You've been listening to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. Until next time, stay awake, stay curious, and stay unfiltered. James Miller. If you found value in today's episode, you may also be interested in my broader project, The Inversiverse, a series exploring the hidden architecture of perception, identity, control, and consciousness. Across 20 episodes, The Inversiverse dissects indoctrination, language, media manipulation, dark psychology, belief systems, and the evolution of self in the digital age. You can find all episodes of The Inversiverse on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, and Substack by searching this place called Earth. These ideas aren't shared to convince you, but to invite you to think, feel, and perceive more consciously in a world designed to keep you distracted. Overview of The Inversiverse, a journey through the mirrors of mind, culture, and control. Episodes 1 to 3 introduce foundational ideas around indoctrination, perception, and manipulation. Episode 4 explores how language, symbols, and cultural norms are used to shape thought. Episode 5 investigates control systems, media narratives, and the illusion of choice. Episodes 6 to 7 dives into collective belief structures and the psychology of mass behaviour. Episode 8 focuses on marketing, control theory, game theory, and critical thinking. Episode 9 covers love, relationships, human mating, gender dynamics, and red-blue pill ideologies. Episode 10 unpacks dichology, the occult, Satanism, and the dark triad personality types. Episode 11 the simulated self examines identity, ego, and the rise of post-human consciousness. Episode 12 the spell of the mind inquires into language, illusion, and physiology of thought. Episode 13 Conscious Seduction journeys through persuasion, propaganda, and the unseen forces of the mind. Episode 14. The Myth of Sanity sheds light on madness, genius, and the edge of perception. Episode 15. The Algorithmic Mind probes influence, identity, and invisible architects. Episode 16. The Noise of Knowing reveals overload, obsession, and the age of infinite information. Episode 17. Belief Machines delves further into language, desire, and the engine of reality. Episode 18. Submerged Signals examines how the unseen shapes the self. Episode 19. The Alchemy Within traces food, frequency, and the forgotten intelligence of the body. Episode 20. Encoded Flesh scrutinizes and opens up to the forgotten language of the body, DNA, and biological consciousness.